Welcome to the talk today on human factors in automating cyber operations. I'm Dr. Robert Gutzwiller at Arizona State University, and I'm joined by my colleague Dirk van Bruggen from the Laboratory for Advanced Cybersecurity Research. I want to start with a disclaimer. The views and conclusions contained in this presentation and document are those of the authors and should not be interpreted as representing the official views or policies, either expressed or implied, of the US government or Department of Defense. So what we're talking about today is really working to add the human component to cybersecurity research. And so cybersecurity operators, we classify them as the general cybersecurity workforce. It's really a workforce with any work roles that have an impact on an organization's ability to protect its data, systems, and operators, and that's a NIST definition. And this, of course, includes incident response. And the cyber defense analyst is a nice representative person or an operator within this realm that uses data collected from a variety of different cyber defense tools, for example, IDS alerts or firewalls, to analyze events that occur within their environments for the purposes of mitigating threat. Now, while humans are very involved in these roles, there really hasn't been a lot of behavioral research across all these different elements and operators. Unlike in other areas, such as space travel or aviation, in which these issues have been examined, cybersecurity is just now starting to investigate these ideas, both from the perspective of the attacker and the cyber defender. Now, human factors tends to look at a large, incredibly large variety of topics, and some of them are listed here on the right. Now, all of these could be programs for research in cybersecurity. All of them have a human factors component, such as thinking about the way that we visualize our data and look at our interfaces for people interacting with systems, as well as the more traditionally psychology or sort of behavior-based investigations about how people make decisions about information in their environments and how they team and work together, how they pay attention to the environment around them, how they interact with advanced technologies such as automation or AI, and certainly the more advanced cognitive modeling of the human defender or attacker in cybersecurity, which does not rely on any live humans, but certainly makes use of our understanding of cognition. And all of them would really benefit from psychological and human factors study. Now, I've been lucky enough to be the founding chair of the technical group for cybersecurity, which is part of the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society, where we've begun to really promote this global agenda of different aspects of human behavior relevant to security. But today, we're going to be talking mostly about automation and AI interaction. And there's lots of reasons why this topic sort of spoke out to us. And one of them is that the cyber defense analyst is a unique job. It's very difficult. There are lots of problems in these job roles. People suffer from fatigue. Job is very demanding, which of course is related and certainly can lead to burnout. There are a very low number of true expertise, true experts in the field. So it becomes difficult to staff appropriately places that need these work roles. There's certainly a lack of speed and scale in operations, and such that if you're limited by a human operator in this respect, then you might be, turning towards automation. And certainly, all of the above contributes to the general expense, both in actual staffing issues, such as paying people salaries, but in also assessing what people within the system should and could be doing for you to advance cyber security and cyber defense in particular, since we're interested in the cyber defense analyst. Now, before we dive too deep, I want to promote this definition of automation, which is really concerning technology that selects data, transforms information, can make decisions or control processes. And normally this is taking over something where humans used to do all of these tasks. And certainly in cybersecurity, there's a large amount of automation at low levels as computers are commonly automated in some fashion. But as the decisions percolate back up to that requiring some amount of human expertise, automation tends not to be performing those things yet. And as people have pushed for additional automation and certainly AI to solve some of these problems of fatigue or a low number of experts, we're starting to notice that the problems found in other domains outside of security when people have attempted to automate these actions have not necessarily been accommodated. And so our talk today really focuses on information sharing here, where we point out some of these issues and tie them directly to cybersecurity in hopes that in the future, systems will be designed for people rather than simply to remove them, which, although it occasionally makes sense, may not be a good long-term goal. And to kick this off, I'd like to start with this notion of ironies of automation, which is a concept really originated back in the 1980s when people were looking at how computers and technology were influencing industrial control plants. And Lizanne Bainbridge published her famous paper, The Ironies of Automation, but continues to this day with authors who have led the National Transit Safety Board, for example, suggesting that many of these ironies still exist in modern systems despite 30 plus years of experience and seeing issues surrounding them. So we start on the left with the issues that we really want to fix by using automation or AI interaction in cybersecurity: the fatigue, the burnout, the expertise issues, the lack of speed and scale, for example, and certainly the expense. However, what you might get are these ironic consequences, and these are derived from other domains in which people have attempted to solve a very similar set of problems: fatigue, low number of experts, expensive, things like that, where when you add automation, you actually end up creating more workload and more monitoring issues for the people still left in the system, which of course contributes to their burnout and fatigue. Automation itself can actually disrupt or degrade people's expertise. The FAA is very aware of this, mandating certain kinds of flight hours and such to maintain pilot skill minus automated systems. And it can even increase the manpower demands. And I mean this in a human system integration sense, in that it is not just how many people you may have to staff, but also what those people do for their training, what those people may require for their jobs, and things like this. And so you hope for all of these wonderful fixes from AI and automation, but what you generally get is worse versions or just new versions of the same types of problems. And so there are some interesting questions you could ask about why this is happening. And of course, it isn't always the case. So there is no sense here that we're saying, we're some sort of Luddites that abhor technology or disagree with its goals. We're simply saying there are some conditions where you may not get what you want out of this. And these conditions include how complex the task truly is. And so, of course, in cybersecurity, we understand that the operators doing these jobs actually manage quite a bit of complexity. Things are very unpredictable. There are very random types of changes and things that occur in cyber defense that really preclude a fully automated approach, which you might be able to take in other domains of less complexity and more predictability. And certainly it requires a certain amount of human interaction. So we haven't removed a person entirely from the system. We don't want necessarily to do that, in my opinion, but certainly no one has successfully done this in realistic ways. And so these are the conditions in which these ironies might emerge. So we have to carefully look at cybersecurity because I do believe it falls under these same conditions. Now, I will discuss two different ironies of automation, and I've kind of grouped them into categories here. So the first irony is simply that by putting automation into the task environment of an operator, you're de-skilling them. In other words, you're reducing the skill, for example, of pilots, especially under conditions that they haven't seen before. And so what happens is people become overly reliant on the automation doing its job and fail to maintain the skills required to really do theirs. And these skills can actually change as a result of implementing that automation. So you might consider that GPS navigation in your car has been a fairly well-established thing since the emergence of cell phones. And certainly navigating a car has always been a skill that one needed to have to drive. However, with the advent of GPS, you no longer have to know the same kind of things. You may now have to know how to operate your GPS in the vehicle, what kinds of mistakes the Google navigation can make in order to monitor for problems in that system that may arise that you need to be aware of. And so not only does this automation implementation potentially reduce the skill of the people in the jobs, but it can also increase their workload because as you have to interact with yet another system in a complex environment, you're now having to, say, monitor the GPS so that it doesn't route you off into a desert, which has happened, which has resulted in loss of life, for example. So it's not as easy as saying, we'll just automate this and it'll be easy for everybody. It can also hide operator deficits. If you have underperforming pilots, for example, a very advanced automated system may actually make it look as if the pilots are highly skilled because there are no problems, no easily detectable problems, when in actuality, they're very novice operators. So almost by definition, some major security issues certainly contain some type of off-nominal condition as well. The kinds of incidents in cyber defense that we understand and that are more routine are actually already, to some extent, handled by some types of automation. We have certain types of systems in place to prevent those issues. But with scaling up of operations, and certainly with the attempt to leverage automation to compensate for a lack of operators with expertise, that almost certainly won't hold. So we'll have major security issues that contain off-nominal conditions, which are the exact kinds of automated ironies that you may get, where the automation is now, removing the kinds of skills that we need cyber operators to have if it's overused or designed inappropriately. And certainly, when it comes to actual skill, that security orchestration automation response solutions like SOARs may actually hide these skill issues the best. And they're very complicated to troubleshoot as well. So as your security workforce begins to use tools like this, it may hide the fact that some of them don't understand some of the underlying issues. And so if those tools break or are otherwise made hard to understand via troubleshooting, you will actually be removing the kinds of skills necessary to succeed in the operations world. A second irony is simply a reduction or a complete loss of situation awareness and monitoring ability. Now, the photo on the right is a photo from the National Transit Safety Board report in 1995 of the grounding of the Royal Majesty. This is a ship that traversed the ocean and found itself up on a part of the land, which is pretty unusual for most modern passenger ships. Now, why did this happen was a question of the NTSB safety report, as it always is. And there's a nice solution or understanding of what exactly happened aboard the ship. Early on in its voyage, the GPS navigational system encountered an issue. And what the issue it encountered was the sensor was essentially cut off from the ship's main computer. And so the ship computer defaulted to a dead reckoning system, which calculates the ship's position based on heading and speed. It does not take wind or the forces in the ocean into account as it does this. So it remains accurate for short periods of time, but over a course of, say, an ocean voyage, ends up being inadequate. Now, note that this is the actual picture of the display from the report here on the right, and that the indication that the system had defaulted to this dead reckoning condition is in a relatively small font located in a lower corner of this thing. So if you had grown accustomed to the GPS doing the hard labor of navigation for you, you would simply rely on the big numbers here and not worry too terribly much about this small one here. You aren't necessarily trained to notice this. Now, in addition, the trail of fixes for the ship actually looked as if it was on her intended track. And so nobody was prompted to say, hey, things may not be going as well as we think. And almost as a direct result, some navigational issues closer to the coast resulted in running aground. Now, those are the kinds of problems that result from the facts that no system is flawless, which means that even when you put automation into practice, it's not going to work perfectly every time. Monitoring is required by humans even when it's demanding and problematic for them to perform. So ideally, you would have had someone constantly paying attention to that display to check for the DR condition to indicate that something else was wrong. However, it's human nature to become complacent and trust the systems that you're working with, especially in the case of GPS, which is fairly accurate most of the time. So there's no real expectation of the shipboard members to really be examining for this. And of course, without any evidence that they were running off course until very close to the coastline where they ran aground, it was highly confident in most of them that that system was working as intended. And so again, while this is an example that comes outside of cybersecurity, you can certainly make some comparisons here about understanding what you think is happening versus what is actually happening, and how automation can actually complicate the picture rather than clarify it here. So no system being flawless simply indicates as you add automation, You are not somehow making the system less error prone. You are simply changing the kinds of errors that happen. And those errors may require monitoring or a demand from the human that's problematic for them to perform. People are notoriously bad at vigilance tasks, for example. Another unfortunate example comes from the Patriot missile battery. This was a multi-mode, so it had manual, semi, full automatic missile defense systems. It was highly touted as a Scud killer back in the first Gulf War. And in the early 2000s, as the US went into Iraq, we had several friendly fire incidents, first versus a UK and then a US aircraft, and also several near misses. Now, when the director of the Missile Defense Agency was asked about these issues, sort of warned that the Patriot system may be shooting down our own aircraft or friendly aircraft, he simply said, I think it could be both human and mechanical error. And this is an interesting moment because this is an advanced state-of-the-art type of system, and the idea that mechanical error is involved is somehow accepted. People understand that that could easily be the case, and they understand that human error could also easily be the case. People fall asleep, they make mistakes, but somehow the combination of that is intriguing and not intuitive to most people. And so this idea is that there could have been something going on in the way that people interacted with the automated and semi-automated version of the missile defense system that may have resulted in these friendly fire incidents. Now, in a great report from John Hawley in 2017, he walks through what's commonly known as the OODA loop, which is the decision cycle that the Patriot battery goes through before it, of course, chooses to fire and engage any sort of enemy target. So the standard stages of observation, orientation, decision, and action are represented, and underneath are the kinds of tasks or questions that one might ask if one is the operator of that battery. Now, there are technical issues behind radar detection and classification, of course, and at the end of the day, there's a nice merger here of the technology and the human trying to answer the questions, the basic questions. What is it? Is it hostile? Should we engage? And if we should engage, under what modes are we engaging in? And it turns out that for the Patriot missile battery, these semi-autonomous and automated modes involve very different kinds of human processes and engagement actions. So in the semi-automated mode, the human operator actually has to authorize engagement or the system will never fire on its own. This is in stark contrast to the automatic mode, in which the system will fire within a certain time period unless the human operator halts that engagement. Now, you can imagine that these cycles are actually fairly quick, as missile defense systems do not have long periods to operate and make decisions. And so this observe, orient, decide, act cycle actually happens very quickly. So in this automated mode, the human operator doesn't get much time to stop an engagement. And as it turns out, that kind of error is what's allowed to propagate through the system and shoot down some of our own planes. So the question is how to do this better. If we understand that there are these general cycles of decision making and information processing, and we understand that it's the combination of the human and the system that makes the system good or bad, what do we do for cybersecurity? And what do we do to ensure that these stages are understood and represented? Before I get to that, I want to mention the importance of trust calibration because you'll hear a lot about automation trust and trust in human machine teaming and things like this. And the general gist here is simply that there are two kinds of issues. There's overtrust, in which we tend to think the system can do lots more than it can. This biases our decision making and makes us more complacent. You can see this kind of behavior in recent Tesla crashes and in the Air France crash in 2009. We also believe that it has more authority or skill than the system really does. And so we tend to misuse it. We say, oh, it can do a lot. We overtrust. This is in contrast to an undertrust pattern in which we think the system actually can't do much, or maybe it can't even do anything. We say, well, we're not going to use that as a result. And then you get incidents related to human automation interaction, such as the Costa Concordia grounding, in which the captain of the ship took over manual control, leaving a very tricky port, and ran the ship aground to disastrous effect. Undertrust is also associated with the notion of cry wolf effects, in which people understand that the automation has made a mistake and it can have issue, and they then take the boy who cried wolf story and put it into full effect. So as the system continues to alert and alarm and annoy the operator, they tend to begin to undertrust it. So even though some of those alerts may be valid, operators over time decide to ignore the warnings of the system. And that, of course, leads to dangerous outcomes. So this is certainly going to be applicable in the case in cybersecurity as we think about advanced automation for cyber defense. But again, what do we really do, or what will we do differently than what people have done in the past in order to compensate for this? And I want to start by pointing out the groundbreaking work of Paris Surman and colleagues in 2000, where they attempted to link the human information processing, in other words, the OODA loop, this is very similar, to the actual machine processes. And so we can think about automation as occupying some level across each of these items. The automation does a certain percentage or a high or low amount of work in acquiring or observing information. It does a certain amount of work or a certain amount of automation in analyzing that information. And then, of course, making a decision, right? Either the machine is highly involved or not highly involved. And finally, in implementing that action. By characterizing these two things as linked together, the authors have established a method for talking explicitly about the interaction component between the humans and the machines when it comes to automation. And as it turns out, I think this is a very productive way to look at these types of problems. One other finding to mention that is that based on these kinds of categorizations, we've learned over the years that it's particularly problematic to implement automation, especially at high levels, denoted by the red here, when the automation is allowed to select decisions or select actions to implement. And you'll note that just a few slides ago, that was exactly the issue present in a Patriot missile battery system. It was a question of how much automation and what mode people were actually in when deciding to fire. Plenty of automation in observation and orientation doesn't necessarily result in bad outcomes. However, high automation in decision and action may. So in thinking about what to do for cybersecurity, we've taken this derivation of some of the recommendations from the same authors and suggested that we could do very similar actions for cybersecurity systems. Now, this really has not been suggested before. And so we bring it to this community and try to elevate it out into the cyber community because it has had success in other domains, such as aviation, for example. So in the first stage of this process, you're going to identify really what the human information processes are related to information acquisition or analysis or decision-making or action. Determine the appropriate level of automation for each of these information processes. So some systems may actually rely or require a high amount of automation and acquisition of information. You have to get a bunch of information from a lot of sources. Others may rely heavily on an artificial intelligence assessment of what's going on, right? So there are various levels across each of these that may be desirable. Now, a key step in this process is after having determined some initial levels and initial capabilities of that automation, you must evaluate the human performance consequences. Again, looking for changes in operator workload, changes in operator awareness, and changes in skill degradation, which can be at times difficult to detect. The point is that this should be an iterative process. So you never stop by simply saying, we designed the automation that met the requirements we thought we wanted. You should instead set these initial levels and then continuously evaluate with the human in mind as each of these is prototyped. And this is something much more common in traditional human systems integration efforts, but really hasn't been pushed out to the cyber domain. And part of it is certainly because those who are doing the innovation tend to be both researchers or product creators. And so their motivations to do these things are perhaps less than what we would otherwise like. So one more salient example of how that method could be applied is to look at the cyber attack kill chain. And this is straight from Lockheed Martin, who published these phases. And so if we think through each phase of the intrusion kill chain and we attempt to link it or identify it as a particular part of the OODA loop, then we may have some sense of the kinds of automated capabilities one would want to develop for each phase of the kill chain. So, for example, taking the kill chain items on the left, you would say, what kinds of automation do we really need for the actions of reconnaissance? Is it all acquisition of information? Or is there actually some analysis and even decision making that's performed in that phase? And if so, what are the human performance consequences of automating that at a high level or at a low level or at some mixture of them? Now, what is performance in this realm is actually very critical to incorporate. But the point again is that you can iteratively go through this design process for each of these general phases, and you will arrive at very different configurations of the system across all of them. It could be, for example, that weaponization and delivery are phases that do not lend themselves well to certain types of automation, whether high or low across this spectrum. But without the notion of incorporating the human, you may simply approach this as a purely technical problem, much like they did with aviation systems in the past, and say, well, we can automate this, therefore we will. When in actuality, the human performing the work is now further degraded or further overloaded by having to monitor an automated system that's attempting to, say, automatically deliver some type of payload. Similarly, we can apply the method to a more blue or defensive kill chain of sorts, again using the same sort of OODA orientation acronym. So defensive courses of action can be taken against different phases of operations. These defensive courses, such as detection or disruption or degradation, may each map onto various human information processes by understanding what the operator needs to do or has done in the past across acquisition and analysis of information, and certainly in decision making. We can make some determination about what an appropriate level of automation may be for a technology capability. Now, of course, as I've iterated before, this is a very interactive and repetitious process in which we understand in more and more depth what a human is doing. We prototype various levels and capabilities of automation across these axes. We do an appropriate and in-depth evaluation of the human performance consequences. And of course, as always, keep in mind the other issues of evaluation in developing systems, such as reliability and cost. Having done this, we assume and believe that the final levels and types of automation will be more appropriately matched to the domain, more appropriately matched to the human, and will avoid the ironies of automation as this process has shown in other places. And you may expand this to consider things like upgrades and auto patching of systems, which is traditionally more of a IT kind of service, but has the same sort of issues in that the person patching the systems has a certain type of information that they need to do. They make certain decisions, they take certain actions, and the appropriate amount of automation may not be between all or none. It may be some combination between, and in order to determine that, we really ought to be evaluating the human performance consequences. Similarly, in defense, users are motivated sort of upfront to overtrust their systems. In other words, if you give a defender some fancy technology that says automation and AI are going to help you disrupt potential attackers, it's very likely that given their level of overload, given their level of potentially lack of staffing and issues like this, that the users are coming in primed to be motivated to say, great, you have a system that does that. Excellent. I'll never look at it again. I hope it's doing it. You already have overloaded users. And so that is a potential issue in defense that could be addressed in terms of finding a better combination of automated actions within a complex environment. So some key takeaways from this talk, and I really do encourage you to read through the paper. It's meant as a historical lesson and a warning, and giving a talk on it is fun, but with the length allowed, not in depth enough. Is simply to always design for users and people, not designed to remove them. The ironies of automation historically arise when people say, we don't need or don't want a human in this job or in this position. And sometimes those are noble goals. Certainly in dangerous environments, we would like to limit the exposure and limit the risk to human life as often and as well as we can. However, there are times in which removing people simply creates more problems. And this has been encountered in a lot of other environments, and I believe it will be encountered in cybersecurity as well. You need to combat the ironies by understanding the users, their cognitions, and their interactions with the system, much like with the Patriot missile battery example. Understanding only one or the other allows you to quickly blame one side of the story, and it really doesn't highlight the complexity of the other things that may be done to prevent these issues from happening. So you need to become versed in these human-centered evaluations and tests, and not just in the deep technology and deep technological issues faced by cyber defense and cybersecurity in general. And to that point, we recognize that to really see this vision through, there's some more research needed. And a big research need is simply to generate the novel and specific evidence for these types of applications in cybersecurity. So we're very interested in knowing what products are out there that are indeed automating job parts of the job, what kinds of processes they're automating, and of course publications on that. You know, vendors tend to have this type of information, but it's largely internal. And so it's hard to develop a field of inquiry around this because some of the information simply isn't out there. And we need that. A second large need is the need to ascertain the state of the art. So there's a practitioner perspective and some anecdotal evidence from people who are out in the field doing these jobs that could be incorporated into the best design and development practices. And this is, again, a hallmark of human factors study, which tends to do cognitive task analysis and other types of investigatory interviewing and task descriptions that help us understand what the goal and the job really entails. And once you start understanding that, it becomes possible to design appropriate automation in these domains. And there has been some precedent for people beginning these types of investigations. In particular, Robert Hoffman and some of his colleagues have been doing this, but it is still relatively rare. And it is also very time consuming. And so we really have to be better at narrowing our scope into particular tools or particular needs. And again, I think the general framework here of understanding what the need is, understanding the human's processes, and evaluating it as we set different levels of automated capability will really get us here into the future where we have developed better cybersecurity automation for real users. And with that, thank you for your attention to this talk. I hope you enjoyed it, and please do read the paper. Feel free to reach out with any comments or questions, and have a nice day.